It's week 3 and I'm in Central Frederick. Hey everyone, welcome to the week 3 feedback video. Okay, I'm in the lovely Central Frederick neighborhood of Kitchener-Waterloo, my own neighborhood. And yeah, getting back to you with some more discussion and feedback on the week 3, all kind of about conceptualization as well as cross-culturally, kind of what do we do when we're doing research with multiple cultures, how do we kind of go about developing our social theory and our concepts, using our concepts, how do we define them, how do we kind of work with respondents from different backgrounds. Okay, so to start, as usual with the mini lectures, went very well this week as well. So congrats on that, getting some great mini lectures. And I'm really enjoying watching them this term. And so, yeah, as usual, my feedback is in Dropbox. So what I do is I basically just update that same mini lectures Dropbox for you with my feedback week to week, as well as with the grade. And so, yeah, you should see that now. And yeah, so that's your individual feedback. As always, if you have any questions for me, you just you can email me, or you can come see me during my office hours on Tuesdays and Fridays. And yeah, and so also we've got the discussion posts that also went very well. Very rich discussion this week about kind of different ways you can implement kind of awareness. Practically, what does a cross-cultural study look like when it comes to working with different groups, with different social groups, with different cultural or ethnic groups in social scientific research. So you brought a lot of your experience to the table there, and that was great, as well as discuss some of the key ideas in more advanced readings. And so here I've got my notes if you're wondering what I keep looking at. One thing that I did notice from the week 3 discussion board is that some of you are still struggling a little bit with exactly what a concept is in social scientific research. So when I was asking about concepts, sometimes I kind of got more direct answers, but sometimes I maybe wasn't sure. There was a bit of fuzziness around what exactly a concept is. You know, obviously you'll find the official definition of what a concept is in the textbook. But in my own words, right, I define a concept as kind of like a key term referring to either a social or a legal phenomenon, right? And identifying and defining a concept is a key part of doing social theory, right? So, you know, obviously social theory are kind of larger frameworks, right? If you want to talk about like critical theory, or I don't know, like conflict theory, or I don't know, in my case I use a lot of secularization theory, for example. Those are kind of like bigger ideas related to how the social and legal world work, which key variables are at play. For example, in critical race theory, obviously racial identity is a big variable in that framework. Intersectionality framework, then you've got kind of a mix of kind of gender, race, and socioeconomic status as being key variables in that framework. So all of that is social theory, but also part of that is how do we define those key concepts? How do we define race, right? Race is a key word, right? A concept that refers to a specific phenomenon in our society. And so how do we define that, right? And definitions will vary depending on, you know, the thinkers that you're using, your own purposes and goals of the research. In my case, how do you define religion, right? Religion is a key concept that I use in my own work. Or how do you define that word secularization, right? Another key concept in my own work. And so again, the concept is kind of referring to a specific phenomenon, but you need to be able to define it to kind of establish the boundaries of what you're studying and what you're not studying, right? And so that's always a key aspect that's especially important to think about at the start of a research project, but that comes into play throughout a whole project, of course. And so in my replies to your week 3 discussion posts, once in a while, I give some examples. So I recommend you go back and check those out and just kind of go back over the whole discussion on the board, which is, like I said, very rich and very helpful as you're developing theory, but especially if you're working, and most of you are, assume are, in a very kind of culturally diverse, or diverse in many ways, context that we are in the Greater Toronto area. So to kind of come back to that specific idea of the cross-cultural use of concepts, I thought that was an interesting way to kind of maybe push your thinking a bit forward on concepts, right? I know many of you have seen social theory and what a concept is before, and so why do you get thinking specifically about how do we work it in a place where things are defined in a lot of different ways and people have a lot of different experience of phenomena that our background sometimes blinds us to, or we don't always think about, or we just kind of assume it, take it for granted, or maybe know that there's different definitions but haven't yet put in the work to actually figure out how do we integrate multiple definitions of something into our work. And so yeah, that's why I wanted us to kind of focus a bit more on this week, to maybe hopefully give you a bit of new material, something that you haven't seen before. And so listen, whenever we're defining a concept and we're trying to adapt it for a multicultural setting, it's never going to be perfect, right? Like there's never going to be like a moment like, aha, I figured out exactly perfectly how to do it. That's not going to happen. So if you're expecting that feeling, I hate to disappoint you, it's probably never going to show up. Right, it's already hard enough to find an agreed upon definition of a concept within one culture, right? Like even amongst like the white settler European researchers that, you know, dominate social sciences in Canada, even they can't agree on a definition of how we define something like, I don't know, religion, race, crime, all those key concepts. Those definitional debates are like a huge part of what happens in sociology and legal studies, and what happens at conferences, and what happens in articles. And so, yeah, already within one culture, we have to struggle defining, landing on a definition that we all share. And that can cause discord, that can cause problems with comparing findings. If you're curious, this is now Frederick Street behind me that I'm now facing that you can't see. That's Frederick, there we go. And that gives the neighborhood its name of Central Frederick. Yeah, so it's already a struggle that causes already a lot of issues. And then if you add in the fact that, you know, amongst your research participants, especially if they're from the GTA, you've probably got many from diverse backgrounds. Hang on. I'm about to get to a quieter street. Then it's like added layers of difficulty and strife for us as theorists of like how do we deal with these definitions that are already now agreed upon in one culture, and now you throw in a whole bunch of other cultures in the mix, right? And so yeah, sometimes it can be daunting and frustrating, and some people just kind of put their head in the sand because of that and be like la 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 la, like I'm just gonna go with this one definition. I mean, in some cases that can work, right, depending on which groups you study and what you're studying, but usually it probably means that you're going to miss something, and that your data might not be quite as rich as it could have been if you'd done a bit of extra work at the start of your project to kind of get a better grasp of how you're going to use this concept in a few different settings, right? Obviously you can't cover everyone, but if you know, for example, that amongst your research participants there's a large South Asian cohort, or a large South American cohort in it, well, maybe you can think through that for that group, that maybe it's worth putting a bit more time in. Is like, is this concept actually relevant for them? Do they experience it and encounter it in the same way that we often do in Western cultures that maybe have traditionally defined this concept? And so, you know, what are the implications if they don't? How do we adapt it if we need to? I think qualitative research obviously here has an advantage because you can just sit down and keep the question open. And so when you throw something out at someone, like, okay, you know, a question like, what do you think about, you know, sentencing in Ontario? Well, then the person can respond and maybe take you through their own background and their own view of it. And you grasp the fact that like, oh, it's actually quite different from what we typically see in a more Western European culture. More difficult to do in quantitative research because we don't get that sit-down time with people, that feedback directly from them in an interview. Often we have to figure out the survey questions and the concepts ahead of time and try and make them applicable for all our respondents, including ones from different cultures, which there's like a whole branch of survey methodology that works on that if you're curious. It's something that I am quite involved in because I sit on StatsCan's Ethnicity and Religion Expert Committee, where we kind of develop questions on ethnicity and religion for Statistics Canada. And these are discussions we often have as part of that. Very difficult, by the way, very difficult to land on anything that actually works. Still working on it, however many decades that StatsCan's been using those questions, even centuries in some cases. And so, and so it's something you need to work on, especially if you're running quant research ahead of time. And especially, but also if you're doing qualitative research, it's something you need to think through ahead of time, right? And so, like I said, worth especially mentioning because we work in what I call like super diverse or hyper diverse settings of the Greater Toronto Area. Like sometimes people forget how diverse this area is. I mean, it can always get more diverse. There's some areas in the countryside that are not that diverse. However, on the whole, like Pearson Airport and the Greater Toronto Area, I've never been to a more diverse area in the world. I mean, I haven't been everywhere in the world yet, so I don't want to like say it's the most diverse ever, but it's up there, right? We're like over half, if not more now, or almost close to 60% of people in the area are born outside the country. And I mean, from a whole variety of backgrounds. Obviously, you know, diversity can mean a lot of things, but if we're just talking like racially, ethnically, religiously, we have a huge amount of diversity. And so this is especially relevant for us if we're, you know, collecting data from this kind of very diverse population in the Greater Toronto Area or in any other area that you're working in that also has quite a bit of diversity, which more and more is most areas that we study in, especially if it's in a more metropolitan setting. And so, I mean, like I said, it's not perfect. I'll give you one example from my own work where we have had to work on this a lot because it's an international project especially. So I work with a research team called the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. And so that is a team from 8 different countries. The leadership is based at the University of Ottawa. And so we're looking into kind of what non-religion is now, how it's kind of evolved, what does it actually mean, what's kind of some of the substantive ways of understanding what not being religious is, kind of what are people's worldviews, beliefs, practices if they're not involved in organized religion. And that project went through, I mean, we're more advanced in it now, but went through like a very long phase at the start where we really had to hammer out what we meant by non-religion. And when we started doing that, we actually, what we thought was pretty obvious as kind of, you know, Canadians or Westerners, even those from the US, is like, well, it's anyone who's not really, doesn't share beliefs or practices or identities tied to organized religion. And, you know, that's kind of taken on, in the Canada and US case, at least in English-speaking Canada, it's taken on a more kind of, you know, the religion that people have in mind is kind of a more white Protestant background religion, like churches and choirs and Sunday services, etc. And so not being involved in that, right, is kind of the de facto way of understanding non-religion in Canada and the US. However, our Argentinian and Chile colleagues have a kind of a bit of a different background perception. So obviously they still have organized religion in South America, but it's mostly Catholic. And so for them, non-religion is actually like a direct opposition or a direct different stance than the Catholic Church. It's actually directly against them. So in South America, it's actually even more political. It's because the church is very involved in politics in South America, in many South American countries. It actually takes on, being non-religious, takes on a more activist kind of political approach of kind of pushing back against certain more kind of conservative Catholic policies, for example. Whereas in Canada, it's typically done in a more kind of what we call quiet or silent way. A lot of people are non-religious, no one really talks about it. It doesn't really involve a whole lot of kind of political protests, or it doesn't involve a lot of discrimination either. Usually in Canada, not many people anymore care if you're non-religious or not. Depends on the regional setting, depends on the family context, but people are pretty open towards it, whereas in South America, it still has a strong stigma attached to it, and that creates a certain experience of being non-religious. Similar, but also dissimilar, even in like Scandinavian countries, you know, where non-religion is very common, but you're still kind of have some kind of tie to a church because there's still like state churches involved. So like you have to pay taxes, or if you want to access certain services, you still have to kind of sort of be affiliated with a church, even if you don't believe in God or you're very non-religious. And then if you go over to somewhere like China, I mean, religion in itself doesn't really exist in the same way in China as it does in the West, right? China doesn't really have these kind of big institutionalized denominations that have like big infrastructure and kind of expect regular practice and involvement from people. What they do have is often a system of temples and of kind of what we would call holy sites that people will occasionally visit, especially on key holidays and on key moments. There's a lot of kind of worship of ancestors and kind of ties to deceased ancestors that are involved in those. But can you actually call that religion in the same way that we see it here in the West? And so, continuing from that, can you actually be non-religious in the same way in China as you are here in Canada and the US? Because most people in China, when you ask them, do you have a religion, the vast majority will say no. And there's obviously ties to the communist government that are linked to that, because it's a secular atheist government. And so sometimes there's stigma to actually say that you're non-religious in China. But even when there isn't, people will typically say like, well, like religion doesn't really exist in the same way. And so no, we're not religious, but we will still go to this, temple that our family has always gone to on certain holidays, right, to provide offerings, to light incense as part of kind of that holiday. But we wouldn't really consider ourselves religious, right? Even though they're doing that kind of what we define as more spiritual activity. And so this is how what you would assume would be a relatively simple concept of not being religious, it actually gets really complicated if you look between different countries and different cultures. Even within Canada, there's already differences, right? I've kind of hinted at this. In somewhere where Catholicism was much more predominant in the past, like say Quebec, non-religion looks more like what it is in South America, because it's again in direct opposition to being Catholic and has certain outcomes and ties to it that we don't always see in the rest of Canada or don't always understand. Obviously, if you're raised in a more conservative Protestant or evangelical family, being non-religious comes with a lot stronger social penalties and a lot more stigma and potentially a loss of your social support network. If you leave religion, maybe your family doesn't want to speak to you anymore, or you get socially ostracized and you have to kind of create a new social network and social support compared to someone who was raised non-religious and who never had to think about that. So there's all of these factors at play, not only between different cultural groups, but also within the same country. People have had different experiences and backgrounds, and that will kind of impact how they define non-religion and what they see it entails, right? And so that's one example, but that is the case for most concepts out there, that's going to be present, and you should be thinking about it for your own research. Give me a sec here, I'll just get my notes back in order. There's like a birthday party on the other side of the street. So what I want to get at was that many of you in the week 3 discussion board mentioned kind of the importance of positionality, right? To kind of think reflexively about your own cultural, social position, kind of disclose that to kind of give readers or people looking at your work a sense of kind of where you stand and what kind of values and backgrounds you might have tied to that stance. And that is, of course, very important. I don't want to discourage that. But I would say it's also probably not enough. Just doing like a quick positionality, be like, okay, well, because I'm a white settler, I'm going to define the concept this way, let's go. Not enough if you've got a very diverse pool of research participants. Because you need to also reflect how they think about things, and if you want to collect good quality, rich data. And so you also, not only do you have to think about your own positionality and kind of disclose it at some point, somewhere, wherever you think is best in your work, you need to also think about like, well, how do I actually make this concept maybe not broad enough, because at some point, if a concept is so broad it covers everything, it's kind of a useless concept. It's not very helpful for your study. But maybe flexible enough that it can adapt to different groups and how they define things. And again, easier to do with qualitative research, because people can give you that feedback and it's a more open format of gathering data. More difficult to do for quantitative research, but not impossible, but does take an extreme amount of work when developing a survey questionnaire ahead of time to be able to account for that as best as possible. And like I said, it's never going to be perfect, so don't expect perfection, but it could be better quality than just going with your classic white European settler definition of something that you probably got from like the old white guy sociologists, classic sociologists like Marx, Weber, or Durkheim or something, right? And so yeah, that's kind of my recommendation to you. Give yourself some time at the start of the project to think this through as part of you defining your concept and part of that theory work you do at the start of a project to kind of account for diversity in a better way, to hopefully improve your research and basically push research forward from studies in the past maybe didn't do this quite as well, right? Okay, so I think that was kind of what I had to say about the kind of cross-cultural definition of concepts. So just want to end this video then reminding you guys that next week, week 4, there's no actual mini lecture to submit. Instead, I'm asking you guys to submit the TCPS2 core certificate after you've completed that online module. So if you've already completed that ethics module that's run by the Government of Canada, and you've done it within the past 5 years and you still have your certificate, then you don't have to do the module again, you can just submit the certificate in Dropbox. So you'll see there's, you use the mini lecture Dropbox, and there's already a few people who've done that in Dropbox so far. But if you haven't completed that module yet, or it's been more than 5 years, or you've lost your certificate, then you just need to complete the module again, or do it for the first time. If it's your first time, it takes maybe 2 to 3 hours. If you've done it before, it takes less than that, because it doesn't change that much year to year, so you can go through it quicker if you've seen it before. And yeah, it's hopefully a good kind of, gives you a good sense of research ethics, their history in Canada, their current relevance, and what we're striving for with research ethics, as well as some of the kind of rules and principles involved there. And so then you submit, you get a PDF certificate at the end, so save that and submit it in the mini lectures Dropbox instead of a mini lecture for week 4. And then if you do that in time, so by the deadline at the end of the day of Friday the 27th of September, then you get 10 out of 10, and that counts towards as one of your mini lecture grades for this term. So no mini lecture, but a certificate, an online module for ethics instead. And there is still a discussion post to do for week 4. So there are more advanced readings tied to ethics for week 4. And so I'll get you to do those more advanced readings, and to post your discussion answers to the discussion questions as usual on the week 4 discussion board. Okay. All right, so I confirmed I've covered everything I want to. So again, I hope you enjoyed the discussion about cross-cultural concepts. And yeah, next week, research ethics. And yeah, we're getting on there already end of week 3, beginning of week 4. The term's going through quickly. The sun is still out, at least right now. And so I'm still considering this summer, but at some point we'll move into fall. It was good chatting with you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. Hello, little squirrel. You're officially our post-credit scene. Say hi to the students. All right, bye everyone.